Greetings and welcome to your Paradise Lost preview. Today we're giving you a heads up on what to expect as you approach for the first time, I think for the first time for most of you anyway, John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, Paradise Lost is an epic poem consisting of 12 chapters, or they're called books, so it's a very long poem. This is not your 14-line sonnet. This is a book that will take you, a poem that will take you many hours to read. It was published in 1674 in England, which is about 40 some odd years after Descartes' Discourse on Methods. It may be useful to know that it's written in blank verse, which is a kind of unrhyming verse. It's iambic pentameter. It's the same verse that Shakespeare uses in his plays. And the other thing you need to know about Paradise Lost is that it is a theodicy. Now, you may be asking, what is a theodicy? And that is the subject of our next slide. So, what is a theodicy? Well, briefly stated, it is an attempt on the part of a writer or philosopher to defend God. Milton says in the first book of Paradise Lost that he has written this poem, at least in part, if not entirely, to justify the ways of God to men. Now, why does God need defending? That's a good question. I mean, he's God, right? He's all-powerful. Why would he need anybody to stick up for him? And not only that, God is great. God is good, right? We're told there's a song that says that. So why would anybody feel the need to defend him? Yet, actually, in the 18th century and the 17th century, there were a lot of writers and philosophers who were interested in defending God. That's why this word was coined, theodicy, because so many people were engaged in this practice. So why would God need defending? Well, think about it. If God created the world and everything in it, then ultimately on some level he is responsible for everything in the world. Now, there are a lot of nice things in the world, like ice cream and puppy dogs, but there are a lot of things in the world that aren't so nice. Things like disease, poverty, famine, war, a little bit out of order there, natural disasters, death. You might think of some other things that you might put on this list. These are just some things that I came up with, but the world is a difficult place. How do you explain, let's say, kidney disease in a 2-year-old? How do you explain mass starvation in certain parts of the world? How do you explain World War II and the Holocaust? Now, a lot of these things, I suppose, you could say are man's doing, but then how do you explain earthquakes or tsunamis or cancer? Because that's not really man's doing, right? And the thing about God is that we're all told that he's omnipotent and he's omniscient, meaning he's all-powerful and he knows everything, so he can do anything he wants. He could cure disease if he wanted to. He could cure poverty if he wanted to. He could stop war if he wanted to, right? And he knows everything. It's not like he's not aware that there are people starving, right? He's omniscient. He knows everything. By the way, I apologize for using he all the time in reference to God, but in the 18th century for sure, the 17th century when Milton was writing, they for sure would have thought of God as a he. But it's also just perhaps a bad habit that I have. But what else about God? Besides being omnipotent and omniscient, well, God, we are told, loves everyone, is full of love. He's merciful. He's forgiving. If he's merciful, if he's forgiving, if he loves, how does he allow poverty to exist? How does he allow disease to exist? Why does he punish people? I mean, conventional Christian religion and various other religions as well imagine, but let's stick with Christianity, imagine a hell after death where people are punished. Now, granted, they may deserve punishment, but he's a God of love and mercy, so how can you account for eternal punishment? Again, not to mention all the terrible things that occur in the world. So, if you think about it, God needs a lot of defending. And some of us have heard various defenses of God, from our ministers or rabbis or priests. But you might take a moment and think about, just like write down perhaps 3 things about the world that you really do not appreciate, that you think require some explanation on God's part. I think if you think about it, you would have no trouble coming up with at least 3. But take a moment and try that, and I'll just sit here and wait. How do you do? Let's go on to the next slide. Now you have to admit, somebody who is willing to step up to the plate and take on the defense of God must be a person who has a great deal of confidence, if not ambition. And certainly Milton was such an individual. Milton, Milton wanted to be a poet, but not just any poet. He wanted to be a great poet. He wanted to be one of the great poets, like Shakespeare, like Homer, like Dante. He wanted to be like Virgil, one of these great poets that are read for all time. And of course, most of these great poets, Shakespeare accepted, in order to become a great poet, what they need to do is to write an epic, because an epic is like the masterpiece for a poet. I mean, nowadays you don't see a lot of poets writing epics, but poets in Milton's day and poets of earlier times, if they really wanted to demonstrate that they had the chops of a poet, that they were of an equal stature or near equal stature to Dante or Homer or Virgil, then they had to write an epic poem. Um, and Milton's ambition as an epic poet was to find a topic worthy of a great poet, of an epic poet. And he searched around quite a bit for this, and he thought of different topics. At one point, he thought about perhaps writing about King Arthur, because he was, this great British king. But ultimately, he decided that he wanted something even greater than the greatest English king as a topic. He wanted something that was more, let's say, international, something that had more import for the entire world. And what could be more important than God? By the way, I forgot to mention this earlier, so I'm sort of inserting this slide arbitrarily into this moment in the PowerPoint presentation. But John Milton was blind when he wrote Paradise Lost. He wasn't born blind, but he became blind later in life, and he actually dictated the poem to his daughters, who wrote it down, and that's what you see here illustrated here in this painting by Delacroix. If you look in the back, you can see there's a painting within the painting, and that appears to be the angel driving Adam and Eve out of the Garden of Eden. So ultimately, Milton turns to the Bible for his subject matter, and in particular the book of Genesis and the story of Adam and Eve and their expulsion from the Garden of Eden, what's come to be known as the fall of man. And if you think about it, this is a great subject matter for Milton, not only because it's a great story, but because it's a great opportunity for his theodicy. I mean, actually, the story of Adam and Eve is the Bible's own sort of theodicy, its own explanation of how it is that death entered the world and pain entered the world despite there being a loving God. And the basic story, of course, is that Adam and Eve disobeyed God and were punished as a result, and as a result, all human beings were punished. But if you think about that, that requires a great deal more explanation than is actually presented in the Bible. Because how is it that they are punished so severely for a fairly simple transgression, eating a piece of fruit from a tree they weren't supposed to have eaten from? And how is it that all their ancestors, you and I included, are share in that punishment, the punishment that includes death and pain in childbirth and having to earn your bread by the sweat of your brow? How is it that all of Adam and Eve's descendants down thousands of years deserve to be punished for something that their ancestors did, for that small decision? This requires some explanation. This requires some defense of God, and so it's a great opportunity for Milton's theodicy. But Milton doesn't just limit himself to the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of man. He also takes on the fall of Lucifer. Now, who was Lucifer? Lucifer was, according to the book of Isaiah, or at least the way that passages in Isaiah have been read, Lucifer was the archangel in heaven, the highest angel, and he rebelled against God out of pride, and he, along with a third of the angels in heaven, and they were rejected from heaven, thrown out of heaven and into hell, where Lucifer became Satan. And this also requires some explanation. This also makes sense for a theodicy to deal with, because why would an angel even think to rebel against God? And why would God punish an angel eternally instead of simply destroying him? And why would God allow that angel to interfere with his creation, to tempt Adam and Eve? All of these are questions that are not really answered very explicitly in the Bible, and so make a wonderful subject for a theodicy. And so the fall of Lucifer is also a major subject in Paradise Lost. Finally, Milton incorporates elements of the New Testament in his exploration of the theme of the redemption of man. And he does this through a character that he refers to as the Son, who is, of course, the Son of God. But he does not refer to him as Jesus or even the Christ, because he has not yet been incarnated into human form. This story, as you recall, takes place either before the creation of the world or early on in the creation of the world, during the time of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And in Milton's theology, the Son of God always existed alongside with God, but had not yet become the person that we know as Jesus. And this is also an interesting opportunity for theodicy, for a defense of God, because it's not immediately clear, it's not immediately obvious, let's say, to the average person or a reader of the Bible or even a religious person, how the mathematics of Jesus' sacrifice works. How does the sacrifice of one man wipe clean the sins of all men? And why would God even allow his only son to die a painful death on the cross? How does that make sense? It's a difficult question, and it's a question that Milton addresses in Paradise Lost. Now, in terms of style, as opposed to subject, Paradise Lost, as I've said, is an epic poem, and that means it uses many epic devices that you'll notice, I think, if you've had some exposure to previous epic poems, such as the Odyssey or the Iliad or Dante's Inferno. So here are a few that you will come across in the course of your reading. First of all, the poem begins in medias res, which means in the middle of things. In this case, it actually begins with Satan lying on his back in a pool of fire after having been thrown out of heaven. So instead of beginning with Satan's rebellion, the book actually begins with the aftermath of Satan's rebellion, and with him and his fellow demons trying to figure out what to do now that they've been defeated. So in that sense, it begins in medias res, the same way that the Iliad, say, begins in the 9th year of the Trojan War, or the Odyssey begins with Odysseus having been traveling for 7 or 8 or 9 years on the Mediterranean. So he's using that device. He uses, if you look at the beginning of Paradise Lost, he invokes the muse, he calls upon the muse to inspire him, typical epic device. He uses a lot of extended metaphors, epic similes. We'll get into that perhaps more as we look at the poem more closely, but you may notice that a lot of times the poem will seem to digress from the main story, as Milton is giving us a very detailed comparison or illustration to make a point, and what he's doing is he's constructing an epic simile. And finally, and in some ways most interestingly, because this is a Christian poem, I mean, that's the interesting part, is he uses a wide range of mythological allusions, mostly to the Greek and Roman pantheon, particularly the Greek gods that we know from Homer. But actually, he alludes to Egyptian gods, Greek gods, Roman gods, Indian gods, gods from all the different mythological systems. And in this sense, also, he's trying to create a sense of epic mythology in his poem. Now, there's a lot going on in these first three books of Paradise Lost, and we're going to be moving through them, fairly quickly, just 1 week. And so there are some things I want to suggest that you keep an eye out for and you make sure that you're paying attention to when they occur. The first thing I would suggest is, especially in book one, is that you make sure you can identify the chief demons. There are 3 or 4 of them in particular who get a lot of time spent on them in books 1 and 2. And so identify some of those chief devils and their personality traits. And then, of course, the chief of the chief devils is Satan himself, also known as Lucifer. And I'd like you to think about and look for ways to think about what makes Satan a natural leader of devils, if not of men. Because he is very charismatic in some senses, and some people see him as the hero of this poem. And a great deal of the poem is devoted to his behaviors and his thoughts and what he has to say. So I'd like you to really think about what makes Satan a leader. And then along with that, I think it's important for you to pay close attention to how Satan talks about God and how he characterizes God. So keep an eye out for that. Take a special note of, in book 2 there's going to be basically a debate between 3 or 4 of these chief demons, and you should pay close attention. Each one of them has a very specific line of argument that they're making as to how they should spend their time, what sort of actions they should take now that they have been defeated by God after their attempt to rebel against God and his angels. And in book 3, you'll see that there's also a kind of a debate, or at least a discussion, between God and Jesus. Although Jesus is never named in the book, he's simply referred to as the Son. And particularly they have an interesting discussion about divine justice and predestination. And I'd like you to pay close attention to that and try your best to really master what it is they're saying. Okay, so Paradise Lost is not an easy book to read. In fact, it may be one of the most difficult works of literature that you'll ever read in your life. Now, I don't say that to discourage you. I say that to challenge you, but also to make you aware of what you're about to step into. But for all the difficulty, it's really worth the effort, and it's a very important book. This poem has influenced writers and thinkers and philosophers for hundreds of years. So here are some tips for maybe making things just a little bit easier. The first thing you should be aware of is that at the start of every chapter or book, there is something called the argument. And what that is it's basically a paragraph summary or synopsis of everything that's going to happen in the verse or poetic part of that chapter. So you should always read those arguments carefully, and you'll have then a better idea of what's to come in the chapter. Here's one that a lot of students are reluctant to do on their own. I don't know why. They feel silly, but you'll find, I think, that your comprehension will greatly improve with this poem if you actually take some time to read passages of it out loud. To yourself, to your roommate, to somebody else in the class, it doesn't matter, but I think that's worth spending some time doing. Maybe you don't want to read all 3 books out loud, you're going to lose your voice, but every once in a while, read a few lines out loud, especially if you're finding a very difficult passage. You might find that it's easier to understand that way. The other thing that I strongly suggest, not only for this work, but pretty much anything we read in this course, is that as you're reading, that you underline and take notes in the margin. Call attention to passages that are particularly difficult for you or that you have questions about, or also passages that you find in some ways delightful. This will help your comprehension and your enjoyment of the book. Now, some of you may be renting books. I think that's a terrible idea. I think it's much better to buy a book, but perhaps you feel like economically the best choice for you is to rent a book. In that case, or you're going to sell your book back, in that case, what I would suggest to you is you use post-it notes to mark up your book, because you can always just remove those. Or write in pencil and then erase it when you're ready to return it. I don't know how that works, but you might give it a try. As you're reading, you're going to notice that there are a lot of footnotes, especially if you're using our editions. Some of the pages are almost, a third footnotes. I don't think you should read every single footnote. You should read them as necessary. If you really can't figure out what Milton is saying based on the context of the lines that you're reading, and you're really struggling to understand what he's referring to, then it's useful to go down and check out those footnotes. But try not to get bogged down in them. But do use them. With a poem like this, you're probably going to have to do some rereading. You may need to read all three books, twice in order to really grasp it. So be prepared. Give yourself enough time to reread sections, if not whole portions, of this poem. And finally, try to enjoy it, because this really is a beautiful poem. This really is a meaningful poem. The language is difficult, but it's gorgeous, and the ideas that Milton is grappling with, these ideas are ideas that have relevance to almost everyone, and even the characterizations are compelling and well wrought, and he has, particularly in the depiction of Satan, but also of Adam and Eve, he's created characters who have stuck with us in literature and in our culture, as I said before, for centuries. So this is a book worth appreciating, worth savoring, and I hope you'll take the time to enjoy it.